Welcome to Our Interesting Times with host Timothy Kelly, who interviews today's top alternative and revisionist thinkers.
May you live in interesting times.
My guest tonight is Servando González. He's a Cuban-born American writer. He received his training as a historian at the University of Havana. He has written books, essays, articles, and multimedia on Cuban and Latin American history, intelligence and espionage, semiotics, hypertext, and art history. His articles have been published in many magazines, newspapers, and websites in the United States and abroad. Servando is the author of many books, including The Nuclear Deception, Nikita Khrushchev and the Cuban Missile Crisis, Psychological Warfare, The New World Order, The Secret War Against the American People, and the most recent, I Dare Call It Treason, The Council of Foreign Relations and the Betrayal of America. Servando, how are you doing this evening?
Fine, Tim, and thank you for inviting me to your interesting times. As you know, it's a Chinese course.
Yes, I know.
And
exactly.
as I was telling you that I have lived under a democracy, under a dictatorship, and under a totalitarian dictatorship. And the change from a democracy to dictatorship was almost unnoticed. Mm-hmm. But then the change from dictatorship to the totalitarian dictatorship in Cuba was really bad. And I'm seeing that is a repetition, so the Chinese course trapped me.
Well, first, you're certainly welcome, and thank you for coming on the show.
No, thanks to you.
Now, the main focus of the show, tonight's show, although we may talk about other things as the discussion progresses, is your book, Psychological Warfare in the New World Order, The Secret War Against the American People, where you put forth a most interesting thesis regarding the true character and purpose of Fidel Castro, the the so-called communist dictator of Cuba. Okay, so your book. Let's get into it. Fidel Castro. Who is he? What is he?
Well, let's go before going to Castro, who was recruited by the CIA in 1948. But first, we need to talk about the CIA, and the origins of the CIA. Actually, the roots of this thing go early in the past century, I would say 1917, when Colonel Edward Mandell House, that was President Woodrow Wilson advisor, and he was actually an agent of the Rothschild Warburg Rockefeller banking cartel, and then he created a group of intellectuals and university professors to act as spies in the signing of the peace armistice in France, and then he called the group the Inquiry. And this group of people, well, the Inquiry was actually a sort of proto civilian American intelligence agency, and this group was formed by Mandell House himself and some other people who later joined what is called the Council of Foreign Relations. They were Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, Christian Herter, Walter Lippmann, Archibald Coolidge, Abraham Harriman, and Herbert Hoover. And these guys met in Paris, and they gathered information to advise President Wilson. Now, since the very beginning, this acted like an intelligence agency. It was divided in several study groups to study different geographic areas like Africa, Austria, the Balkans, Far East, and Latin America, Pacific Island, Russia, etc. And then this division was very similar to what later the CIA called desks. Okay, and the inquiries activities were surrounded in secrecy, and they were paid from hidden funds directly from President Wilson. Now, after the signing of the armistice and the creation of the League of Nations, that later was not approved by the U.S. Congress, the two groups, because there was a similar group of British agents, and then they met in a hotel and they decided, well, this is so good, this is so nice to be spies. Why don't we keep this and make this official? And then from this, they created two different organizations. One that is called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the British branch, and the other one, the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's very important because sometimes most people don't really know what the Council on Foreign Relations really is, and forget about what the New York Times and Foreign Affairs says. It's not a club of the very rich, of the bankers. It's actually an intelligence agency for the bankers. That is what the Council on Foreign Relations is. I'm going to talk about this later. Now, after they created and they have worked like intelligence agents, gathering intelligence for the masters of the bankers, the CEOs of international corporations, and the oil magnates and the source. Now, during the Second World War, they created another intelligence organization called the Office of Strategic Services, that in my book I call Of the Bankers, by the Bankers, for the Bankers. That was in 1942. And then the one who was the chief of the OSS was General William Donovan, a millionaire Wall Street corporate lawyer, and his right hand was Allen Dulles, also Wall Street lawyer, and other Wall Street related guys like Frank Wisner, William Colby, that later they joined the CIA. The origin of the CIA is in July 26, 1947, when President Truman signed the National Security Act that created both the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. The National Security Council, in my book, was created to surround the presidents with the national security advisors to manage the information that gets to them, and as I mentioned in my book, to give them the mushroom treatment, that's keeping them in the dark and feeding them manure. And that's what the National Security Council acts. Now, question: how come, if the Council on Foreign Relations is an intelligence agency, why they need another one? Well, this is took me some time to find out, and then I think I have an answer for this. Well, the conspirators, I call them, in the Council on Foreign Relations, and I call them conspirators because you know very well that they have some goals that have nothing to do with democracy, actually the destruction of democracy, the elimination of borders, and the creation of an international government controlled by them. And if I go further, to kill 85% of the population in this planet and turn the survivors into medieval serfs. So the very rich and the very poor, and this I call a real-life Hunger Games. Now, they created the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. Why? They had one way. The thing is that they needed also a strong arm hand to carry out the governments that they cannot force to do what they wanted. They use military arms, and for that they were using the United States Armed Forces. But they found some some real American officer who really took the oath of office for real, that were not happy with that role, fighting wars for the bankers. The most known was General Smedley Butler. And if you read his, actually was a long speech, War is a Racket, you see why most honorable military officers were not happy with the role of being the army of the bankers, and they had that trouble. Then they created the CIA. Now, the CIA, its role as the name implies Central Intelligence Agency, was to act as an office gathering information and changing it into intelligence. By the way, most people who get into the field of intelligence espionage, they don't see that there is a cardinal difference between intelligence and espionage. Even books written by people close to the CIA, they confuse them. And what is intelligence? Intelligence is just information that has been evaluated, that has been validated. And in my books, in psychological warfare and other books, there's a part where I explain the methodology that I use, that I copy from a NATO document. But I think that the most intelligence agencies, the KGB when it was, the Mossad, the MI6, they use something similar. And then it's based on the evaluation of information. You evaluate the information with certain methodology, and then that's the role of an intelligence agency: gather information and change it into usable intelligence. But that was not the role of they care about the CIA because they had their own intelligence agency. And then see what happened. Less than a year after the CIA was created, secretly, people in the National Security Council created something that is a monster, that is a branch of the CIA for covert operations. Okay, and always the person that was the chief of covert operation was a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Okay? So they don't care about the CIA. That's why some people so the CIA has two sides of a coin. One side that is the true purpose that is covert operation, and the other that is sort of a cover that is gathering intelligence agency. Now, some people, true patriots in the intelligence branch or area of the CIA, they were not happy because they produce intelligence, and then the government took totally different methods or acted totally ignoring what the CIA had produced, the intelligence. So the intelligence produced by the CIA was never taken into consideration by the government. Why? Because they were taking the intelligence from the Council on Foreign Relations, because they control the U.S. government. And these have created many things that even in the, when was that, in the 50s, when Bush was in the CIA, they created what is called the Group P, that was people who questioned the intelligence produced by the CIA. So, and this is very important, the role of the CIA. So the CIA is fully an organization under the control of the Council of Foreign Relations, bankers and conspirators who are looking forward to the creation of destroying the national borders and created a new world order. And this is very important to understand what is happening, because some people like Seymour Hersh. Oh, he's always criticizing the CIA. Well, the CIA is a tool. We need to go a step further. And I mentioned this before getting into Castro because actually Castro was recruited in 1948. He was 21 years old. He was a law student at the University of Havana. He was a gangster. He already had killed two of his enemies at the university. He was into politics. And then I have information. I read the cable from the American embassy in Havana. They notice him, and there is probably some things that are I have no real proof, just that he had been in the United States before, and probably they saw him before, and they recruited him. And I began researching the subject many years ago, and then I explained in a long article that I titled tongue-in-cheek, Fidel Castro's Super Mole. And that was probably the first article that I published in the internet many years ago in a site called Sumeria. Doesn't exist anymore. And this I mentioned the possibility, again, tongue-in-cheek, a little, because I have no real proof, just suspicions based on some evidence that the same way that the CIA had a chief of counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton, who was convinced that the KGB had infiltrated a secret agent, a mole, into the CIA. I say, well, using the mirror image vision of intelligence, well, there should be in the KGB a chief of intelligence that I called him Angletonovich, and then that he suspected that the CIA had infiltrated a mole into the communist camp, and this mole was Fidel Castro. And in this article, I gave some background information, but very speculation. But then many years later, I found a guy, a Cuban, who was a member of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was captured and stood in prison in Cuba for, I think, a couple of years. Then he was liberated and came to the United States. And he wrote a not well-known book. He self-published in Miami called The Secret Crimes of Fidel Castro, where he explains at the very beginning that he was working for the CIA early 1948. He was working for the CIA in a low level. He was called what they call a muscle man. These people who, if force is needed, they act. And then he was with another Cuban also working for the CIA in a car in a place east of Havana, in area of mansions in front of the mansion of a residence of Mario Lasso. Mario Lasso was a American educated lawyer that have close ties to the American embassy in Havana. And then Fidel Castro was invited to a secret meeting with some people there. And among the people were several people linked to the CIA. And then he went with his friend Rafael del Pino Sierra. And then they were, and this guy was in a car in the shadows close to the mansion, looking, and they were armed to see if Castro did any of his crazy things, pull a gun, something like that, and they were going to act. And Castro went there. They were some time there, and then he said that he knew that Castro was recruited, that he had a guy who was his controller, and he was sent to Bogota, Colombia, as an agent provocateur to create chaos there and then blame the communists. keep in mind that and then on April 9, in 1948, there were violent riots in Bogota, Colombia. They were called El Bogotazo, the Bogotazo riots, that destroyed the central part of the city. It was incredible. Many people were killed. And then the riots began when somebody killed a populist leader, Gaitan, and then the riser and Fidel Castro was there. And then all the indications see that he threw some flyers in a meeting, and then he was acting like he was a member of the Cuban Communist Party and was linked to the KGB, and well, this is all CIA disinformation. And then and this is how Castro was recruited by the CIA, and that was a total success. It's interesting because the Bogotazo coincided with there was a very important meeting in Bogota, Colombia, the 9th conference of Latin American chancellors or secretaries of states, and was presided by George Marshall, General George Marshall, that at the time was U.S. Secretary of State. And it's interesting.
And CFR agent too, right?
Oh, yeah. He
Marshall Plan came out of the CFR.
Oh, yeah. He was one of the traitors.
Yeah.
Big traitor. And I have the big traitors, and in my book I explained that that he had direct participation in the assassination of General Patton. But that's another chapter, sad and dark chapter of our history. Now, it's interesting because the essence of this meeting were to convince the Latin American leaders of the creation of the Organization of American States. But there was some reluctance because there had been a previous meeting in Mexico, I believe, and then the United States promised a lot of money, a lot of things that never accomplished, and then the Latin American leaders were reluctant to sign the creation of to support the creation of the Organization of American States, and then the riots erupted, and there was the killing, and then everybody was scared, and then Marshall used the opportunity to scare everybody, and then they not only approved the creation of the Latin American States, Organization of Latin American States, but also they signed a very anti-communist document, and that the role of Latin America was going to fight communists, blah, 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 blah. So
this is your classic problem, reaction, solution.
Yeah. And then, and then it's a Hegelian.
Yeah.
And then, this is the beginning. Actually, that was the beginning of the Cold War in Latin America. That's what started the beginning of the Cold War in Latin America. Then Castro was rescued by the Cuban. He went with his friend Del Pino to the right to the Cuban embassy, and then there was a plane that mysteriously appeared, and then he was flown to Cuba. And then when I was writing my book, I was talking to a Cuban in Miami, and he told, "Oh, we know there is a journalist who was in the house of Grau San Martin. Ramon Grau San Martin was the president of Cuba at the time, and he was a nationalist leader. He was not a right or left. He was just a nationalist leader. But the Americans hated him because he fought against the Platt Amendment, the elimination of the Platt Amendment in Cuba, and they didn't like him. Well, and then this friend connected me to a journalist who was a close friend of Grau San Martin, the president. And then during a visit, another friend of Grau San Martin was there. That was the guy who was Guillermo Belt, who was the Cuban ambassador in Bogota at the time. And then the journalist asked Guillermo, well, Guillermo, why did you help Castro? Put a plane for him? You told me that you hated Castro. And then his answer was this, well, because we get orders from above. And then he turned not to Grau San Martin, not to the president, but to the north. And then we get order from and pointed to the north and said, and then we have to save him. Okay? And that's the story of Castro. Now Castro disappeared from the limelight, and then Batista was a guy who was the president. He left Cuba, and then he was a military man, and then came back to Cuba, and then he gave a coup d'etat and became a president through a coup d'etat, and became the dictator. And Castro tried to overthrow Batista with a military action in the east part of Cuba, but failed, and he was sent to jail. Just less than a year later, Batista signed an amnesty, and he was freed and went to Mexico, created a group of revolutionaries, and invaded Cuba. And then he won.
Was that the July 7th movement or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Movimiento 26 de julio, 26th of July.
Oh, sorry, yeah, July 26th. Yeah,
see, because the 26th of July was the date of the attack on the Moncada barracks that the Castro was survived. Most people were killed, but he managed to escape, and he was captured and sent. It's a longer story. And then he went to Mexico and created this guerrilla group, and went to the Sierra Maestra mountains, and then he invaded and won the battle. Now, we know later that the battles were not won with lead, but with gold. It was dollars that they came from the American consul in Santiago de Cuba. That's the capital of the eastern province of Cuba, who was also a CIA officer. And most of the weapons that he got in the Sierra Maestra came through the Guantanamo base. And then he simply, instead of fighting the Batista army, he bought the officers.
Was this his arms? Was that like the International Arms Company or something?
The what?
The International Arms Company, like reverse CIA or something that supplied to Castro's munitions.
Yeah, there was a company, I don't remember now the name, but also the CIA was behind the operation. And then and nobody knew in Cuba about Castro. Nothing was happening. They were in the Sierra, but nobody knew about that. Life was working. And then the conspirators sent their agent from the New York Times. This guy from the New York Times that went there and then interviewed Castro. And then he was created the myth of a Robin Hood in the Sierra Maestra.
This was Herbert Matthews?
Herbert Matthews, yes, sir. And then he was a pro-commie, being in the revolution in Spain, and then and that is that's the story. And we have been sold this revolution. Actually, the American left has created a myth. Okay, according to what you read, most of what you read, is Cuba before Castro was like Haiti. Okay, Cubans were was a very underdeveloped country, but that's a lie. That's a lie, and it's absolutely a lie. Cuba was not when in 1959 when Castro took power in Cuba. Castro was one of the most developed countries in Latin America and the world. Okay, and this is not that. This is I'm going to show you why. When Castro took power in Cuba, Cuba had a system of telecommunication by microwave that was unique in the world. Not even in the United States we have this. Why? Because an American company was testing the system in Cuba. Because Cuba was so close to the American markets that the guys in Lexington Avenue, the marketers, they discovered that the Cuban public was so close to the American public that they used Cuba to test American products before launching it in the American market. I remember something that probably you still have in your kitchen, some cleaning that's called Ajax. Mm-hmm. Oh, we had in Cuba 6 months before they launched it in the United States. When Castro took power, in Havana alone, we have, I think, 22 or 23 radio stations. Probably 1959. Probably today, 2016, Paris doesn't have 22 radio stations. We have 5 or 6 TV channels, 3 of them national-wide for the whole. Cuba is a lone island. And then the first color TV station in the world outside the United States was in Havana. Have you heard about that before?
Well, I read about it, and you wrote about it.
Well, and then we have newspapers. I remember there was a Diario de la Marina, one newspaper. The Sunday Diario de la Marina was thick, almost an inch thick, when the New York Times was when the Sunday New York Times was also 1 inch thick. We have this newspaper. So Cuba was not an underdeveloped country by any stretch of the imagination. Cuba had a very developed middle class. My family they were not professional. They were just blue-collar workers. My father, my 2 uncles, they worked in the railroad, and they had very good salaries. We have our own home, a big house, many rooms. So the Cuban middle class was similar to the American middle class, a middle class of well-paid workers. And the Cubans, even though after the War of Spain, there was a lot of American capital. After the Second World War, the Cuban capital began recovering industries, and most of the sugar mills were in 1959 were already back in the hands of Cubans, the Cuban capital. So, and this is what Castro created his revolution that we need what the Cubans were expecting was a rebellion against a president who had become a dictator.
That's interesting because one of the real reasons for the Spanish-American War was that the bankers, National City Bank, the Rockefellers, coveted the sugar fields of Cuba, wanted to get control of it, and they used the excuse for Spanish oppression in Cuba to start the war.
And so they sent the main battleship that mysteriously exploded in Havana Bay.
Exactly. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Yeah, that's right. And so what you're saying is that indirectly, using Castro as an agent, you're saying is by the 50s, Cuba was developing so well economically, and Cubans started to get a hold of their own natural resources again. Mm-hmm. And one way the Wall Street and the international bankers would get control of again would be, to send Castro in as an agent to reverse all that. Contain and impoverish.
Yeah, that is interesting because I read. You remember that in the 1980s, Mexico is a very rich country. I've been in Mexico several times. It's a very rich country that has all mineral resources. It's a agricultural land. It's a very rich country. Resources. It has a very educated working class. And really working, and then in the 80s, Mexico was developing, and something happened. The peso collapses, and the economy crashed. And later, I read something that initially I thought was who say that was Henry Kissinger, but now I found new information that apparently was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who say we cannot allow for a Japan south of the border.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
Well, the first Japan south of the border, we have been Cuba. And some people here say, no, we should not allow this Japan south of the border. They fear Japan in Cuba. I remember that the Batista was a dictator, but the last 3 years under the Batista dictatorship, the economy in Cuba was booming, incredible, like never before. And there were so many plans for development in Cuba. One of them was that some of the Hollywood companies who were paying high amount of taxes in the United States, they have put an eye on Isle of Pine. There is a big island south of the western part of Cuba, and then called Isle of Pine. That is the isle mentioned in Robert Louis Stevenson Treasure Island, and they plan to move eventually some of the studios to Isle of Pine. Isle of Pine already had a free trade zone, and then some companies were planning to make subways in Havana, and the Malecon, that is this beautiful promenade close to the sea, is like a U, and they plan to stray this and build, I don't know, 10 big hotels and all this stuff. And it's interesting because it's now the economy of Cuba, the Cuban economy, the indexes of the Cuban economy are probably below Haiti. And in 1959, Cuba was only second to Argentina, and probably Argentina is only, and in some things to Mexico, in a very few things. Okay, but Cuba produced most of the food, most of the meat, was self-sufficient, and well, everything was destroyed. So it's an example of taking a very well-developed country, a country with a very well-developed economy, and in a few years turning it into a land of poverty where there are just two classes: the all-powerful rich, that is Castro, his family, and his what is called the nomenclatura, and then the rest of the people that live like medieval serfs. Well, that is exactly what the New World Order is about.
Yeah, it sounds like Maurice Strong, Club of Rome, these things. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's interesting because sometimes 15 years ago, David Rockefeller and a group of people from the Council on Foreign Relations, and then later was Kofi Annan, who at the time was the chief of United Nations, and they were marveled when they saw Cuba. Oh, this is a marvel of education here, the public health, and they say openly that Cuba was a model to follow. Well, I see what they were talking about. By the way, more than 20 years ago, I began talking to relatives and close friends. Well, what is happening in the United States remembers me what happened to Cuba. Oh, Servando, you're crazy. Well, most of them now agree with me.
Yeah, the slowly erosion or destruction of the middle class.
Yeah. And this is not by chance. Well, now you see my books. That my books are about the conspiracy. Well, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, I have my degrees in history. I'm a historian by training, but working in when I began writing the book on Castro, I realized that recent events where there is a large amount of intelligence and espionage to analyze and write about these events, the tools, the methodological and analysis tools of the historians don't work. And then I began learning by myself the trade of intelligence espionage. I became myself an intelligence analyst. That is what I am now. And I began writing my book not from the point of view of a historian, but from the point of view of an intelligence analyst. That's why in my book about Castro, The Secret of Fidel Castro, Deconstructing the Symbol, I mentioned in the introduction, this is not a history of the Cuban Revolution. This is not a biography of Fidel Castro. This is a CPP, Comprehensive Personality Profile, like most intelligence agencies keep of foreign leaders. The KGB, the Mossad, the MI6, the Vatican, they keep working in this CPP, Comprehensive Personality Profile, and then using a similar methodology, I created my own. That is this book, and I followed for this. My model was a book written by a member of the OSS, Professor William Langer, that was a CPP about Adolf Hitler. And then after many years after the end of the war, it was published. That was a secret report on Hitler, and then was published under the name The Mind of Adolf Hitler. And this is the model I followed to write my book about Castro. And I say in my book, well, the CIA has one, the KGB has one, and I have one, and mine is probably not exactly the same as the CIA, but this is, I think I have reached something that not many people have written. And my point of view is not anti-Castro, it's not from the right, or from the left. I'm trying to be totally impartial and about what I found in his life. But let me tell you, is to be terrorized. The guy is a monster. There's no other way to qualify the guy. Like Hitler is a monster, so we have the Castro here. Some people he's a psychopath, and then and the Rockefeller put him in power. He has been always.
Well, that's what's interesting is you mentioned the comprehensive personality profile. In your book, you mentioned there's some problems with his life if you're going to reconcile it with his supposed figure as a communist revolutionary. Is that he seemed to admire much of America. You mentioned that he wrote a letter to Roosevelt when he was 12 years old. Supposed to be an agent. He wanted a $20 bill from Roosevelt.
Yeah, probably because Robert never sent the money. Probably that's what began hating America.
He aspired to be a pitcher for the New York Giants, and he also was a bit actor in a couple films in Hollywood, correct?
Yes, something that I found, as a researcher, because I told you, I use a different methodology. A historian only read history books and an article written in peer review magazine or whatever. No, I read everything. And then this I found, it's not in a DVD that somebody created about Hollywood films.
That's right. Most historians just end up quoting each other, unfortunately.
Yeah. And it's a historian look straight, and an intelligence analyst look with the side of the eye. You look at things.
Exactly.
It's a totally different approach.
But you found this DVD with these old movies, right?
Yeah.
And what did you find?
I found that he has worked in two films, which is one is Carnival in Mexico, and the other one Esther Williams and Javier Cugat, the musician, and he was probably he had no role, just an extra.
Yeah, actually,
but the point is, in order to work in this, he was in California. That is not mentioned in any biography of Fidel Castro.
And that's quite a gap, if you're right. I mean, that's an interesting.
And another thing, apparently he was very good as a pitcher, because eventually they tried to recruit him, and when they say, well, no, I decide I have other things to do. Boom. And then he refused
of all the teams, all the baseball teams he liked the New York Yankees.
Yeah. He didn't accept the offer. And this I found the first person I heard about this was this guy. What is his name? That he had the problem. The rest of the story.
Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey.
Or Harvey.
Yeah, Paul Harvey. Yeah.
Paul Harvey. And then I found some reference, and I wrote to the guy of the national, the director of the National Archives, and he had the and he sent me a photocopy of the letter that he wrote to Roosevelt. So that is my book now. And this is something. One day, because I've been in many parts of the United States, I was in Air Force Place in Mobile, Alabama, and I was with my son in a line in a post office, and there was a guy behind us. And then he listened to us talking in Spanish, and he talked to us. He's an American. He talked Spanish, and then we were talking to him, and I don't know what. There was a long line waiting, and then he told me that he was a filmmaker. He was going to Brazil next day and then the conversation went into Cuba, and he told me that he was working for military intelligence and that he got his training at Quantico.
Okay, so sorry. He was in Hollywood.
No. This guy I met in Alabama.
Okay, but you're saying maybe I misunderstood you. Are you saying he worked for Hollywood? Did you say he worked in Hollywood?
No. That's Fidel Castro. He was
I misunderstood.
He's another person that was on the line.
Okay.
On the line, a conversation. He said, "Oh, you know that I get my training in Quantico. At the beginning, the CIA get trained the people before they have what is called the farm. They trained in Quantico. That was where the CIA trained people." And he told me that in Quantico, he heard rumors that Fidel Castro had been trained there. I have no proof, just this. On the other hand, the first KGB agent, the first Soviet agent that they sent to Cuba was a guy that what's his name? Sergei Alexander Alexeyev, that later was appointed by Castro, the Soviet ambassador. This is a story I'm going to tell. This is very interesting. and then Alexeyev went there, passing as a journalist for Izvestia. They have two newspapers in Russia, in the Soviet Union, Pravda, that means true, and Izvestia, that means news. And the joke was that the news have no truth and the truth no news. Anyway, he was a journalist for Izvestia, and then it's interesting. Alexeyev tried to recruit Castro, but you know what? Castro ended up by recruiting Alexeyev. So that means that he had some training in intelligence and espionage. It's obvious that he was trained.
And there are gaps in his biography. He's in the United States.
He was trained. That is incredible. By the way, do you know that Castro expelled a Soviet ambassador from Cuba?
Yes, this was related to the coup that Khrushchev had planned or something.
Yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well,
there's another dimension to that thing, which most people don't know.
Let's jump in. We're going back and forward to make this thing interesting. I was an officer in the Cuban Army during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then not in a very important function, but I was an officer and I knew many people there. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, nobody in Cuba, at least at my level, knew what really was going on. Actually, I knew because there was another officer who was listening to the Voice of America, so we discovered what was really going on by the Voice of America. Okay, and then according to Khrushchev, you know the story. Oh, Castro, Nikita Khrushchev placed missiles in Cuba, and then Kennedy was offered the U-2 planes took a photograph of the missile bases, and one CIA photo interpreter show Kennedy the ultimate proof and about the missiles in Cuba that started the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? According to Nikita Khrushchev was the Soviet Prime Minister at the time, And then in his memoirs, he gave an explanation. He said that he was in the Cuban Missile Crisis was October 1962. And then he was in April in Bulgaria, and he saw over the sea and said, oh, the Americans, they have nuclear missiles there in Turkey, pointing to Russia. And we are very upset about that. And I'm going to give them a taste of their own medicine. We're going to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to protect Castro. Well, that is Khrushchev's explanation. But this really is very difficult to take because it was in April 1962 when Castro expelled a Soviet ambassador from Cuba. The name of the ambassador was Sergei Kudryavtsev. This Sergei Kudryavtsev was a fat guy and doesn't look very important, but he, according to Barron in his book KGB, he had been expelled from Canada some years before because he was the guy who stole some of the nuclear secrets. And Barron called him master spy. And it seems that Kudryavtsev and some KGB guys in the Soviet embassy in Havana linked to a group of members of the Cuban Communist Party, the true Cuban Communist Party, not the Communist Party created for Castro. And let me explain to you that Cuba traditionally had a very strong Communist Party. And then these people were conspiring to overthrow Castro by force. And then Castro discovered the operation and then apprehended the Soviet ambassador Kudryavtsev, put him in jail, and next day, without letting him chance to change his underwear, put him in a plane to Moscow. Like that. A few weeks before, Castro had recalled his ambassador, Fabricio from Moscow. Now I'm asking you, when two countries retire their ambassadors, how do you think about the relation between these two countries? Are very high, very low?
A bit strained.
Strained. Usually, sometimes this is the beginning of a breakdown in relations. So, and that was the time that Nikita Khrushchev chose to give Castro nuclear missiles. So was he a masochist? He was crazy? I don't think so. Another thing that is Kudryavtsev was sent to Moscow. What Nikita Khrushchev did to Kudryavtsev, who acted so crazy, shot him in the war, sent him to Siberia. No, he was appointed in a high position at in Paris at the UNESCO. That means that Kudryavtsev didn't act by himself. He was following orders from above. Now, another thing that is strange on the Cuban Missile Crisis is this. In intelligence and espionage, to accept something as a fact, you need to have, when something you accept as a fact, when this links well to previous events. So, and the Soviets never before the Cuban Missile Crisis placed nuclear warheads outside their borders. And sometimes, I think they had missiles in Poland and probably in Czechoslovakia capable of nuclear capability, but the nuclear warheads were kept in Soviet territory. Moreover, the warheads were not even in the hands of the army, were controlled by a special Spetsnaz group just to take care of the nuclear warheads. Okay, so never before 1962 the Soviet put nuclear warheads out of their borders, and never after. This is something strange. Okay, even more. They in all the literature about the Cuban Missile Crisis, except in my book, there is mentioned something important about nuclear warheads that is called radiation. Nuclear warheads emit radiation, gamma rays, and there is nothing that was detected, the nuclear warheads emitting a radiation in Cuba. And the United States, America, have the technology to detect it because in the Dardanelles Strait, they have some sophisticated equipment to detect nuclear radiation from Soviet submarines under the water. So the technology is there, no radiation. Then the CIA say that the missiles were in Cuba. Now, again, the proof that was given to President Kennedy was the photos by the U-2s. And the CIA photo interpreter, his name was Dino Brugioni, went to the White House. Oh, this is this, this is this, this is it, this is it. Well, the CIA saw some things in Cuban soil similar to nuclear missile bases in the Soviet Union. But the point is this: there is some long wooden boxes covered with tarps that the CIA say that inside these boxes were the missiles. There were some concrete bunkers that the CIA say they contain the nuclear warheads. Then, after Khrushchev decided to retire the missiles from Cuba, there were some things covered with tarps on the deck of the Soviet ships that the CIA say were nuclear warheads, but nobody touched, smelled, measured the radiation, and much less photographed the missiles. So, in my conclusion, what the Russians were retiring from Cuba? The guess of the CIA were nuclear missiles. My guess were Havana cigars for Nikita Khrushchev. My guess is as good as the CIA. I have no proof that were Havana cigars, and the CIA had no proof that were nuclear missiles back to Cuba. Also, it's strange. Why didn't Kennedy order the American ships to stop the Soviet cargo ships and physically inspect the missiles? Why? Many things that defy logic and explanation. In my opinion, the fact that there were nuclear missiles in Cuba with a nuclear warhead has never been proved, period. And this is final. I have read many books after I wrote my book, and the rest repeat the same story. McNamara went to Cuba, and there were 8 nuclear warheads. Then some Russians said, no, there were 20, there were 80, there were hundreds of nuclear warheads in Cuba. Nobody has proved that. In my opinion, it was just a scare operation that Nikita Khrushchev, that was a theory when I published my book. Now I have other theories without discarding this, that Nikita Khrushchev wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro, but he couldn't do it openly. He was not going to overthrow Castro because that was a big scandal. Castro was a communist, and you cannot do that. And then they say, well, let's provoke the American to do the dirty work for me. Now, let's suppose that the United States had invaded Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They went to Cuba, killed a lot of people, fighting there, and they went to the nuclear bases, and no missile here, no nuclear warheads. What would have happened? Then Nikita Khrushchev would have gone to the United Nations and accused strongly the United States for invading a country like Cuba, poor Castro. He was killing action in Cuba, he was hanged, whatever. And then Well, he put a egg in the heads of the Americans and also got rid of Castro.
Yeah, the blood would be on the American Empire's hands.
Yeah, that's my theory, and I
very interesting. And
and I don't see it seems crazy, but it's the only one that explains a lot of things.
And what explains why the United States were not invaded is because Castro was ultimately working for the CFR, which controls.
That I discovered later. At the time.
Yeah. But
it
would explain why U.S. Has tolerated Castro for so long.
Of course. You know. They can kill an American president. They can kill people all around the world. They cannot kill this crazy guy in Cuba. According to Castro, they tried the CIA tried to kill him 80 times, 200 times. Well, there is something interesting. When the Cubans in Miami, controlled by the CIA, tried to kill Castro, the CIA allowed it, but they always failed. Yeah? The powder was not the one. The poison never worked. Now, when a group of Cubans out of the CIA, out of the control of the CIA, freelancers tried to kill Castro, what happened? The FBI captured them and said, no. Shh, you cannot do that. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's all. And we see this happening and happening over and over. But the interesting point is that if you want to know what is coming to the United States, what is the New World Order, just go to Cuba.
Yeah.
Just go to Cuba.
And but this explains perhaps the failure of the Bay of Pigs, right?
Oh yeah. No, the failure of the Bay of Pigs. The people blame Kennedy. Kennedy acted on the advice of some CIA guys who all of them were members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Another one that advised Stevenson, a United Nations member of the Council of Foreign Relations. And then they followed that advice, and that's why after that, Kennedy realized that something was wrong with the CIA and say, I'm going to destroy the CIA, break in a 1,000 pieces and throw it to the wind, and which, big mistake. He fired Allen Dulles. Big mistake. And he paid dearly for it. So he realized that the CIA was not doing what it was supposed to. So the CIA has always protected Fidel Castro, and
well, you also mentioned that like during the in Canberra rebels or something where they were given the wrong ammunition, and also you had the Cubans in Florida, which actually rounded up just before the Bay of Pigs, right?
So rounded up and put in the Opaloca base, and then they all then in the most of the landing craft were destroyed by the reef. That was very clear in the YouTube photos, but never was told. That was an operation. So in my point, the Bay of Pigs operation was a total success because the goal of the operation was to keep Castro in power, and it reached the goal. Now, before the Bay of Pigs, there was about 8 or 9 very strong anti-Castro organizations, very active in Florida, in the United States, mostly in Florida. There was a strong group of guerrillas in Cuba, in the central part of Cuba. Cuba has three group of mountains. In the east part, the Sierra Maestra, and the central part of Cuba, the Escambray, and other small in the west. In this Sierra del Escambray, the central part of Cuba, there was a strong group of guerrilla fighters fighting the Castro government, and they have been strong for months and months. And the CIA stopping sending them ammo and guns, and were kept out of the information about the invasion. Also, so there was the anti-Castro groups in Miami. There was the guerrilla groups in fighters in the Escambray, and also in the big cities, there was an anti-Castro underground ready to fight when an invasion was produced. All of them were kept in the dark. So what did the CIA did? They consolidated all the anti-Castro groups in Florida in one and decapitated it with the failure of the invasion. So the invasion made Castro stronger, and that was the purpose of the Bay of Pigs invasion. So to me, it was a total success. It was designed to fail, and it failed. Period. There's no other explanation.
Yeah,
never in the history of the United States you have planned a landing at night. It was at night. So everything was the Three Stooges planned the CIA planned the
so they did everything to frustrate a popular uprising, which was the ostensible plan was the invasion would spark an uprising, but the CIA or elements within the CIA, the CFR agents, were working to prevent that very thing from happening.
Absolutely.
At the same time, Castro would be shown the victor, and he would earn street cred or credibility, or his bona fides, so to speak, as a communist opponent to American imperialism in the Caribbean would be solidified in the eyes of the Soviets, correct? Because they might have suspected.
Yeah. Now, in my opinion, creating a model or testing ground of the New World Order in Cuba was like a second thought. Initially, the plan to use Castro was for other ends. The problem is this. Nikita Khrushchev had been after Stalin and then several leaders. They elected Nikita Khrushchev, and then Nikita Khrushchev, who had been an officer in the Soviet army during the war against the Nazi Germany, and he saw that 60 million Soviet citizens were killed during the war. He lost a son in the war. He was affected. Everybody was affected by this war. And then he realized that a nuclear war had no survivors. That was crazy. And then he launched something. Well, in a secret speech of the Soviet Politburo, he made this speech condemning the crimes of Joseph Stalin, and also he launched a new policy that he called his policy of peaceful coexistence. The policy of peaceful coexistence.
Now that would have scared a lot of people.
Yeah.
The Pentagon and Wall Street.
The military-industrial complex that later I call the military-industrial banker complex were scared. We're going to lose our enemy. There is no reason for our existence. Then they put Castro in power in Cuba. Since the very beginning, Castro began trying to infiltrate the Soviets, but the Soviets were reluctant. They were not buying. They are not buying because, I'm a communist, I'm a socialist. They were not buying. But then came the Bay of Pigs. One day at Stanford University, I was talking to a Soviet scholar who was there, and he told me that during the first days of the Bay of Pigs, the newspapers and media in the Soviet Union were preparing the Soviet people for the fall of Cuba, of Castro Cuba. But suddenly, Castro won the battle of the Bay of Pigs, and this convinced the Soviet leadership that Castro was true. A very important thing that they had suspicion about Castro was Nikita Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev. He came to the United States 30 years ago, became an American citizen, and he was a college professor. And in a speech that he gave in a college, he mentioned that a long time ago, when he was a teenager, he was in the Kremlin, and he overheard his father, Nikita Khrushchev, talking to a small group of high-level Soviet leaders that they had suspicions about Castro, because Castro was he was a lawyer educated by the Jesuits, his father was a landlord in the eastern part of Cuba, and they suspected that Castro was an American agent. That's said by Sergei Khrushchev. Well, then came the Bay of Pigs, and Castro won. And that was the fact that convinced the Soviet leadership, Nikita Khrushchev among them, that Castro was real. And then they began supporting Castro. Now, what? And they opened their arms and accepted Castro. What Castro did exactly as he was accepted into the Soviet field, he began strongly criticizing Nikita Khrushchev's doctrine of peaceful coexistence, and then began creating guerrillas in Latin America, in Middle East and Africa, and so he began fighting the Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was a traitor to the communist movement because we need to fight imperialism, American imperialism. Mm-hmm. So he began fighting Nikita Khrushchev. So that was good news for the American military.
Yeah, that creates an arena for drug running, arms deals.
He was involved. He was involved in that, and even killed some of his officers. There is a Cuban writer who said that Castro ran out of enemies and began killing his friends.
And then, killed more friends than enemies.
Yeah, the guys that he killed because of the drug trafficking were not involved in that. And then just simply that's his way. He's a psychopath.
But his role is to stir up trouble throughout Latin America. I guess this would create it's a strategy of tension. This would make maybe the wealthy class, the people that own capital in Latin America, maybe not to invest it locally, but to send it abroad, perhaps to Chase Manhattan Bank as opposed to keeping it in a local bank.
And he helped the flight of capital from Latin America to the United States was because insecurity created by Castro's guerrillas and many things. But also
it also creates greater indebtedness because as the capital flies, those companies have to borrow more.
Yeah. Also, when Castro invaded Angola, mm-hmm. and then the invasion of Angola. By the way, at the time, I was not a member of the military, but I was in the reserve. In Cuba, you get in the military, then you go to the first reserve, and then after 60, you get to the second reserve. Everybody's in the military, and then they accept some people from tankers and pilots that really who invaded Angola were not soldiers from the army, were reservists, and I got my training to be sent to Angola, a very tough training. Fortunately, I was in the last groups, and then there was an international scandal, and I finally was not sent, but there was many people sent to Angola. Now, Castro went to Angola. Now, who profited? The first things written about Angola was the Soviets used their puppet Castro to invade Africa. Not true. Even though the material, the tanks, the planes, the trucks, everything were Soviet, but they used even merchant ships to Cuba to ship these things to Cuba, to Angola, and the Soviets had no part in the invasion. The Soviets, in my opinion, they believed that Castro was going to fail, and they were going to allow Castro to fail, but then, surprisingly, Castro was winning, and they began supporting Castro. Now, during Castro was in Angola, he was getting money from some companies, and then after Castro took power, most American corporations took power in Angola and controlled the country. So the Soviets never profited from Castro's invasion of Angola. Actually, the ones who profited were American corporations.
Yeah, like Gulf Oil, that's a fact. Right? Like Gulf Oil, right? He was protecting the oil platform, the oil fields.
They were
so you have communist soldiers protecting the assets of American multinational company like Gulf Oil.
And being paid in dollars.
Which is kind of like the entire Cold War, isn't it?
It's interesting. So there are many things that part that doesn't fit, and at least my explanation, that I don't claim that everything I tell is true, is the right explanation, but at least I have found a theory that make all these things a whole that makes sense. Because the other thing is, things happen because they happen. But no, things don't fly. Now, why I have centered my recent study in the Council of Foreign Relations. There was an old saying that all roads lead to Rome, and now all treason lead to the Council of Foreign Relations. Behind every act of treason to the people of the United States, you are always going to find, and this never fails, you're always going to find one or more members hiding in the shadows, one or more members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Because it is an intelligence.
This is the most anti-American organization. The enemy is inside our borders. In my recent article, I write for an organization called News with Views, and always even I published there before putting the article in my site. And then I wrote an article, and at the end I say about Trump, and then I say, well, one of the things that Trump will do is to reduce the 50% the pay of the officer and admiral, the high brass in the military, and even retire to 50%. Why? Because they take an oath of office to defend the Constitution from enemies, both abroad, foreign and domestic. And they have never, the latest one who defend the Constitution from domestic enemies were George Patton, that I remember, George Patton, and Smedley Butler. So if they do half of the job, they should be paid half of the pay.
Yes.
Why none of these military people who are fighting, defending us for enemies abroad, never defend us from enemies here? And
our foreign enemies are financed by the CFR. And
through different channels, and you see George Soros. Who is George Soros? George Soros, he makes money. No, the Rockefellers made George Soros. Maurice Strong. I read some time ago that Maurice Strong, he died recently. Maurice Strong was a security guard at the United Nations. And then it was Nelson or David Rockefeller who talked to him, and then what? And then so he's a millionaire and fighting for the environment. And the same Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was a sergeant in military intelligence, and Nelson Rockefeller was also military intelligence. He found Henry Kissinger, and then Henry Kissinger, professor at Harvard, and then okay, they're all these people are reflections of the Rockefellers and other bankers.
Yes, this transnational elite or
superclass. We don't need to invade Afghanistan. We need to invade Wall Street. Tanks, rockets, missiles, whatever. This is what the enemies are.
Well, Castro again. Castro seems like one of these sort of like a bacillus, the same way that Lenin and Trotsky were sent into Russia by London and New York.
Winston Churchill that they send Lenin like a virus.
To destabilize Russia, to weaken it and impoverish it, to kind of so it doesn't compete with the West.
On the other hand, don't underestimate Castro. He has been an agent, but not a puppet. In fact, I think that at some time he threatened the Rockefellers. Mm-hmm. Oh yes. He mentioned that he had no nuclear missiles, but he had plans that he can drop bombs in a nuclear plant in Florida and create a nuclear catastrophe in the United States. And then, well, I have the opinion that he had an active role in the assassination of President Kennedy and many others that we ignore. So, and the Rockefellers know that the guy is not being is difficult. Is a real and present danger.
Well, yeah, David's 101 now, but he did have a quote a couple of decades ago that kind of gives us the at least him and the whole milieu or super class that he's a part of. He said in his memoirs, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it."
I'm proud of it. Yeah. And the interesting now in Cuba. The thing is that they have been working. The Council of Foreign Relations have been working for almost 10 years, and they had a lady there, was her name Julia Zweig, that is heading this. That is to keep Castroism in Cuba after the death of Castro. Yeah? And then Castro became very sick 8-9 years ago, and he retired. But then, surprisingly, he sort of recovered. And then forget about Raúl Castro. The person still in power in Cuba is Fidel Castro. The thing in Cuba is that the Cuban government under Castro has never been a pyramid. It's a truncated pyramid where you have Castro on top, number one, and there are no number twos, and there are several number threes. Okay. And every time that one of these number threes seems to go reaching number two, Castro eliminates him. That happened to the first one, Camilo Cienfuegos, that was in command. That happened to Che Guevara. It was, in my opinion, the killing of Che Guevara was a joint CIA Castro operation, and happened to many others. So and so Raúl Castro has never had any real power in Cuba and has no knowledge of power. So and Castro is still in power. And see that now when Obama took this unilateral action in Cuba, Castro immediately began criticizing strongly Obama for trying to change things in Cuba. So while Castro is alive, no change will be in Cuba. There is no change while Castro is. He's still in power in Cuba. Believe it or not, he's still in power. And Raúl Castro is old. He's very sick. He's an alcoholic, and he has no power, no real power. So, and this is the Cuban conundrum. And unfortunately, things are changing in the United States, resembling what we had in Cuba so many years ago. And this is real bad news, and the only hope is Donald Trump. There are so many theories about Donald Trump, but my point is that there is by the way, I'm not a member of the Republican or Democratic Party, and I promised myself many years ago never give my vote to any incumbent or to any member of the Republican or Democratic Party. So if Donald Trump goes independent, I give my vote. If he's run as a Democrat, I never give him vote. But there is some people have suspicions about Trump. I would say, well, there is a 5% of possibilities that Trump is not what he says that he is. But on the other hand, there is 95% of possibilities that Hillary Clinton is controlled by the Council of Foreign Relations. He said that. He said publicly when they were inaugurating the new CFR building in Washington, D.C. That's where I go to get my orders. And that's unfortunately that's what is going on in America. But this we are living really interesting times. Don't you agree, Tim?
Oh yes, unfortunately we are. I yearn for the quiet life, but yes,
Yeah.
things are getting very interesting, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
you
But
spelled it out.
Yeah, unfortunately.
You spelled it out
First.
well. Is how this got going was the formation of the Council on Foreign Relations, 1921, coincided with the creation of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Both of these grew out of the Rhodes Trust, which is this scheme created by Cecil Rhodes in his will to establish an Anglo-American global empire. And this is kind of what we're talking about here. But what you're saying is the CFR created all these desks, or
The dream of Cecil Rhodes.
Yes. And the idea was, well, this is how it works structurally or practically, was these guys, the CFR, were so well organized that when the American Empire came into its fruition, I would say arguably after World War I, but through the 30s into the Second World War, which was created by the same people who created the First World War, really, they're in a position to swarm the all the agencies that popped up, whether it's the expanded State Department, the National Security Agency, and the CIA. So they're in a position immediately because they're the experts, right? And you saw that. I think it was the CFR had the War and Peace Studies, which is a Rockefeller study, planning out post-war Europe in 1939,
controlling the State Department.
Yeah, and so they had all their ducks lined up, and they could take over these. They were in a better position to manage the world because they were succeeding the British Empire at that point. Although at this point the British Empire is a shell, but so is the United States. Because behind this are the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the bloodlines, the elite families who control the central banks and the financial situation in the world, who make money off all the blood. And all the blood that's spilled in the wars, all the debt that's created. You were mentioning like what they have planned for Cuba. Well, I mean, if that's not just speculation, because in 1974, Henry Kissinger wrote that National Security Study Memorandum 200, calling for the impoverishment of the third world through debt, and also that's one of the reasons why they created the oil crisis, was to destroy development in the third world. You know?
On the other hand, it seems that we have put a rebar on the CFR machinery. I just published an article in 3 parts that I titled "How the CFR conspirators miscalculated." The first part is the internet. They have lost the monopoly of information. Second part is the new Russia, Putin. And the third part is Donald Trump. So let's see.
Yes, see what happens. I don't know. Like you, I don't put much faith in electoral politics, and much less Donald Trump. But I do know. I know what you're saying. I do see some hope and some resistant power block, like whether it's China or Russia. This isn't to say I respect the regime in China or I respect Putin. It's just to acknowledge that maybe they represent different interests or a different bloc that can at least check the madmen who run the Anglo.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's much better a war controlled by 3 bad guys that that having one controlled by only bad guy.
Yes,
because then the 3 bad guys fight each other.
Because there's some chance of sanity. You're right. Yeah.
Because they were thinking
the reason why they want one world. They're talking about
unipolar war. The total hegemon, like you see, but the plans are not going according to the oil machinery that they have. Something is wrong. That the machinery has the stall.
Yes,
that's a fact. So let's see, Josh. We need to wait. We are living very interesting times.
Well, listen, Servando, I want to thank you. We're coming up on an hour and a half, and I said I wouldn't keep you longer than that. And I want to stay to my word here. Listen, that's great. Okay, your most recent book is the I Dare Call It Treason, right?
Yes, but the one that is the heavy. I think that one of my books, the heavy way is psychological warfare.
Yes.
And the New World Order. If you read that, then you can go to the one, because this is the one that really gets you up to speed in what's really going on, and it's written in a very clear language. Also, I'm a scholar, so the book has more than 1,000 scholarly footnotes. It's not that I listen on the internet, so it's very well researched and very well supported by very, very important data.
That's right. Read it as an intelligence analyst, not as an historian, and you'll see the true picture. That's exactly.
That's correct.
There you go. Listen, thank you.
No, thanks to you, Tim. This is very. I had a great time.
I did too, and maybe we'll keep in touch. I got to read your second book. When I get to that, maybe we'll talk about that again.
I dare call it treason.
Yeah, I dare call it treason, and when I get a chance to read that, perhaps we'll discuss that, or maybe some others. Maybe it'll be after the election, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'm working. I need to wait and update the book with all the second term of Obama, and then what is the future? I don't know what.
Yeah, well, no, we don't exactly. So great. Listen, good night then, and take care.
Okay, thank you. Same to you. Bye.
Bye.